Good morning. I'm Ellen Horstman in Camden, Arkansas with the First United Methodist Church. Our Sunday school has been looking at a book by Bishop Michael Curry called Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times. Now each week, Bishop Curry answers a question that he's been asked, often several times, about love, about agape love, about having unselfish love for other people. This week he said that the question he wanted to take up was this one that he's heard many, many times. I'm just a regular person. Can my love really have an impact? I'm just a regular person. Can my love, can my agape have an impact? Well, before we discuss that question, I've chosen a selection from the Gospel of Luke. So let me put my reading glasses on here, and I'm going to turn to chapter 21 in Luke and read these verses. Now, if you're reading this part of Luke, the disciples ask him about the end times, and he tells some things Jesus does that are going to happen. But then he says this to them, sort of, I think, to let them know, oh, you don't have to worry about waiting for the day of the Lord. Things might get bad anyway. Well, but let me read this cheery little section. But before all this occurs, they will take you into custody and harass you because of your faith. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will provide you with an opportunity to testify. Make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance. I'll give you words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to counter or contradict. You will be betrayed by your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, and your friends. They will execute some of you. Everyone will hate you because of my name. Still, not a hair on your heads will be lost. By holding fast, you will gain your lives. Well, isn't that a cheery little selection? Because what was Jesus telling his followers there? You see, I think sometimes that we get the notion that if we allow God's grace to come into our life, if we decide that we're going to follow the path of Jesus, that we're going to be disciples, well, everything should go well. And here Jesus is telling his disciples, not only are things not always going to go well, but, oh, people are going to harass you, they're going to persecute you, some of you will be executed. But hold on. So, with that cheery little thought in mind, and I guess what I'm trying to say is things will not always be easy. But with that cheery little thought in mind, let me turn back to the question that Michael Curry said that he was answering. I'm just a regular person. Can my love have an impact? And when I heard that question, I thought, now, why do we ask a question like that? What would cause us to ask a question like that? And friends, I think we ask it. We may not word it exactly that way, but we often think, well, can what I do really make any difference? But why would we ask this question? I'm just one person. How can my unselfish love make any impact? Well, I thought, why do we ask? It could be humility. Or is it fear? Or is it a lack of trust? Or is it because we've tried something before and we haven't seen a result? So we feel like we're not making a difference. Because somehow we think we're always supposed to see an end result. In the course of the chapter 6, I guess it is, of Curry's book, Curry said this about young people. He said, the error of youth is to think that an effort has succeeded or is only worth trying. Let me start over again because I kind of flubbed that. The error of youth is to think an effort has succeeded or is worth doing at all only if we can see its fruit. So he's saying young people think that if you don't succeed, you haven't succeeded, or you shouldn't put forth the effort if you can't see the results, if you can't see the fruit of that. And I remember when I read that, I thought, young people, that's the error of young people? A lot of us, I think, not only do we make that error, but some of us make it over and over and over again. We think that if we don't see a positive result, or we don't see it as quickly as we think we should, well then, it must not have been worth doing. It must have been the wrong idea. How many of us as individuals have given up when maybe we felt called or compelled to move in one direction to share God's love, but things didn't go as we thought they would, so we gave up? How many times have churches given up? How many times have churches been afraid to even try an idea? Now, I'm not saying that you try every idea that comes along. I think it really should be tested with prayer. But sometimes the pastor of the church or some of the leadership in the church sees a direction they believe the church can move to witness to God's people, to share God's agape love, and other people hang back and hold back and put obstacles in the way because they're not really sure it will succeed. Sometimes you get a persistent person with a vision that keeps on, and I'm thinking right now of a little church that Larry and I knew well, where two women had a vision of having a food pantry, and they just kept persisting at it and got quite a bit of guff, quite a bit. And yet, in spite of all the criticism, they just kept keeping on, and eventually it blossomed into a wonderful mission. I see a church sometimes that has an opportunity. Say you have a church that's being called towards being involved in injustice ministries, in looking around at the community where there's been racial injustice for a long time that we may or may not have been aware of, and maybe you have some individuals or leaders in that church that feel that the church is uniquely positioned where it can help with that, and then other people begin to put obstacles in the way, and then the leaders just give up. I mean, that's what happens sometimes. We're bad about doing that. So we need to hear that question again. Well, we're just regular people, or we're just a regular church. Can our love really have an impact? Can it really make a difference? Should we keep on keeping on? Or I could put it another way. Do we ever give up on agape love? Do we ever decide, oh, well, it's not worth the effort? Listen to this. All progress for good is a struggle. It's pretty obvious, you see me gesturing down, that's because I got the Bible on my lap, but it's pretty obvious that Jesus let us know it was going to be a struggle. He did it in this passage that I just read to you. He told us over and over again that if you want to be my disciples, you have to take up a cross. Remember, that wasn't a pretty piece of jewelry. It was an instrument of torture and death and suffering, and you have to be willing to do that for the sake of being my disciple. All progress comes from struggle. And progress, and what I'm calling progress, is moving towards the good. It's a slow and winding road. It's not a straight and linear path. It never happens like that. You take a couple steps forward and you get knocked back a step or two. And then you take another step forward and maybe you get knocked back 3. But you keep on going. And we see progress in everything. Christianity itself, look at what a small little church it began as, and how it's blossomed into a worldwide church. But it's had a lot of ups and downs, hasn't it? I mean, life is not always good in the life of the church. And we could see that in our own government. We started a democracy here in the United States that became the envy of all the world. We wrote some great documents, but at the time that we began our country, we had people in slavery, constitutionally allowed slavery. We had women and all males who did not own property had no right to vote. People did not direct elect their senators. Well, I could go on and on. We haven't overcome everything as a country, but we've steadily marched forward in the progress to forming a more perfect union. So that's the way life is. It's a struggle. It's a process. If it's God's work, then the good is always going to triumph. It's just that you and I don't always get to see it. Does that mean that we give up the struggle? I'm just a regular person. Can my love make any difference? You know, we can't always see the impact that we're having. Bishop Curry makes a really good point in his chapter, and he says basically your job is to plant the seed and let God take care of the rest of it. Your job is to plant the seed. And that makes me think of Paul in the first letter of Corinthians. At one point, he said, I planted, Apollos, which was another disciple after him, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Progress is slow, it's twisty, it's winding, it's discouraging. But if we're on the side of good, eventually God's good is going to triumph. And maybe we need, as humans, maybe we need a struggle. We don't value those things for which we do not struggle, which makes me think of a line from Emily Dickinson that I didn't know I was going to quote as I do this lesson. But let me go ahead. Let's see if I can remember how it goes. She says, "Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires the sorest need." In other words, we don't really appreciate success unless we have had to deal with a lack of success. So our job is simply to do our job. One of the things that Bishop Curry said that I really loved in his chapter is that there's a very little difference between you and someone like Mother Teresa or Abraham Lincoln. Now, you might not feel as accomplished as they, but what is the difference? He said, the difference is that you're supposed to do your job, and Mother Teresa was supposed to do hers, and Abraham Lincoln was supposed to do his. You just plant the seed, you do the job that God gave you to do. And you're not always going to see the end results because progress is not always linear. I'll give you a great example from my own professional life. I was a teacher, and for a number of years I taught senior high, and in particular I always had the 12th graders. Well, when kids go, especially the ones that go off to college, but even others who go on to other fields, when they leave high school and they go on, and especially if they're going to college, you know, they encounter these situations where they need to be able to write, they need to be able to think. And so, lo and behold, they decide that their 12th grade English teacher just hung the moon because she taught them how to write, she taught them how to think. So if you teach 12th graders, you sometimes have the benefit that they come back and visit you and tell you what a wonderful teacher you are, which is not a bad thing. I kind of liked it. But I knew that that wasn't really the case. I'm not saying I wasn't a good teacher. Let me be careful how that sounds. I knew I wasn't the only one that taught them. I remember one time Larry and I went to see a specialist that Larry needed to go to for surgery. And the specialist had been a student of mine, and in he came, you know, this doctor, and he told us all about how he had done so well in undergraduate school and even in medical school because I, Miss Horstman, had taught him everything he needed to know to think and to write. And as we were leaving his office and going on out of the building, I said to my husband, you know, he thinks I'm responsible for all of his success, and he had a lot of other teachers that helped him. But let's not disabuse him of that notion until after your surgery is over with. Most of us don't necessarily remember the kindergarten teacher who taught us how to line up, the librarian who taught us how to do research, the 4th grade teacher who gave us some structure and taught us about sentence structure, and I could go on and on and on. All of the teachers, and some of those teachers in the elementary school don't necessarily see the fruit at the end. It makes me think of a teacher that I worked with. Now, I guess she saw some fruit because she would do this. The whole time that she was at my little school, and it was a number of years, once the very first set of kindergartners she had got up and were graduating, she started coming to graduation. And for years after, for another 12, 13 years after she retired, she came to every graduation of each of the classes that she had had in kindergarten. So I guess she got to see some fruit that way. The point is, it's not what one teacher does. It's what all the teachers collectively do that helps a student get where he is or where she is. And most of us as individuals can't go back and say, oh yeah, you know, I learned how to add in so-and-so's classroom, or, well, I was going to give you another example, but it floated away into the Netherlands, so I won't go there. I'm just going to say, we don't always know what kind of effect we're having when we're planting those seeds. Now I'm thinking of a totally different story. A fellow I met, I think he was in his early 70s when I met him, and this man was born in 1900, and he was what they call a dirt farmer, no formal education, and he had 20 acres, and I mean, worked it by hand all his life, lived in we would call it a shack. I mean, he had cut the trees and hewn the boards himself and built it by hand. It was a very small house, a very modest means. But he and his wife, all their life, they sold vegetables out of what they called truck patch farming. Actually, it was wagon patch farming when he started. And one time after I'd met him, I'd been in town, and lo and behold, here okra was selling in the grocery store for 45 cents, and it didn't look nearly as good as Mr. Jim's okra. So I went to Mr. Jim and I said, Mr. Jim, they're selling okra in the grocery store that's like Kohl's compared to what you're selling. Why, you could get 35, 40 cents a pound for this. You're selling it for 15 cents a pound. Well, Mr. Jim went to town once a week and sold to regular customers, many of whom were not well-to-do, many of whom were widows. And here's what he told me. Well, Ellen, we got to have consideration for them widder women. So in other words, he wasn't going to raise his price because it might be too hard on his customers. Now, Jim doesn't know this because I didn't know it at the time. How could I have explained what that witness of sharing God's love, what a difference that would make in my life as it kind of percolated into my hard-headedness? One simple farmer, one simple statement, one simple act. Plant the seed. God will give the growth. You don't have to do it. Bishop Curry told about his time in a place called Lincoln Heights, in a African American neighborhood, very poor, and a lot of work that he did, following on the heels of others who'd gone before, and work that went on and things that didn't succeed. And he talks about how he doesn't know whether all the seed he planted worked or not. I'm fiddling for my glasses here because I want to find what he said. So here we go. So he says, in Lincoln Heights, many worked hard to plant seeds. But the truth is, I don't know whether the tree has matured, and maybe it's not my job to know. My job is to plant the seeds of love and to keep on planting, even or especially when bad weather comes. It's folly to think that I can know the grand plan or how my small action fits into the larger whole. All I can do is check myself again and again. Do my actions look like love? So I'm going to stop Bishop Curry for a minute and say, there's the key right there. Yes, it's easy to get discouraged. But when we remember that the God of grace loves us, agapes us, and calls us to love, then that's our job. It's to love. So what Bishop Curry says is, I don't know if my actions are going to do any good, and I don't know how they fit into God's great plan, but my job, as he says, is to check myself again and again. Do my actions look like love? And he goes on. If they are truly loving, then they are part of the grand movement of love in the world, which is the movement of God in the world. In the church, I have reminded us that we are part of the movement that Jesus began, the Jesus movement. And if that is so, we are a part of a greater whole, and that means it doesn't all depend on us. It doesn't all depend on us, and yet it's my job to do my job, and your job to do your job. And what is our job? Our job is to love as God has loved us. Our job is to love God's people where we are. We're not always going to see the results of that, but that doesn't mean that we give up. That doesn't mean the seed have not been planted. That doesn't mean that God's work is not going on. Bishop Curry was telling another story about one day meeting the famous musician Hugh, let me say his name right, Hugh Masekela. There we go. Now you're going, oh yes, Hugh Masekela. Well, some of you might be. He was a great trumpeter and very famous, composed a lot of works, was well known all throughout the world. But one day, Bishop Curry, and I can't remember what town he was in, but he said that the chaplain at the place where he'd been preaching came to him and said, Hugh Masekela is here, Bishop Curry, and he wants to meet you. Well, that startled Bishop Curry. Why does this famous trumpet player want to meet me? So he went to meet him, and so Masekela told him, every town I'm in, or every place I am, if I find a bishop of the Episcopal Church, I want to meet him. And Curry said, he didn't know what to think because Masekela was from South Africa, and there had been some South Africans who were a little put off by the Episcopal bishops. But he went to, he asked him why. And so Masekela told him this story. he said that when he was a young boy, he'd gone to see a movie. He went to school in a school that was run by, that was a private school that was run by a charity. And there was a priest there by the name of Trevor Huddleston. So Masekela had gone to see a movie, and it was about some guy, I think it had Kirk Douglas in it. He was a famous trumpeter. And Masekela just got a gleam in his eyes, and he decided, oh, I want to play the trumpet. And so he went and told Father Trevor Huddleston, Father, I want to learn to play the trumpet. Well, Huddleston saw a little gleam in that young boy's eyes, and this was a kid that was trying to get in trouble all the time. So he moved heaven and earth till he found a trumpet for that boy. And then he found a local band leader that played the trumpet and got him to start giving Masekela lessons. And Masekela got really, really good. So good that eventually when Louis Armstrong heard some music that Masekela had performed and recorded, Armstrong sent one of Armstrong's trumpets to Masekela. Well, in the meantime, here's Trevor Huddleston. He was a priest at the time and would later become a bishop and then an archbishop. But Huddleston was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement very early on in South Africa, and particularly he was really hard demonstrating to try to keep Sophia Township. Sophia Town was one of the few places where sort of middle-class black people could live like middle-class people, and the South African government wanted to take that away from them. And so Huddleston and others were helping with demonstrations, but they didn't succeed. Sophia Town was shut down, and Huddleston was sent back to England because he was kind of labeled as a troublemaker. And so his help with the apartheid movement to try to get rid of that terrible racism in South Africa, he had to do from a distance. But lo and behold, one of the seeds that he had planted without knowing that he had planted a seed was that in Masekela, the trumpeter, who became a great composer of music. And you see me searching, sorry, I'm distracting my own self. He became a great composer of music, and he wrote some of the key pieces of music and played some of the key pieces of music that helped fire up people for the anti-apartheid demonstrations. And so here's what Bishop Curry says about that. You know, he talks about how Huddleston had got sent back to England as a troublemaker, but, says Curry, we know what happened in South Africa. The struggle continued. Huddleston kept fighting from afar, and eventually it was to the tune of Louis Armstrong's trumpet in Hugh Masekela's hands, backing a choir of marching voices, that Jericho's walls came out tumbling down. It is impossible to know in the moment how small an act of goodness will reverberate through time. The notion is empowering and it is frightening because it means that we are capable of changing the world and responsible for finding those opportunities to protect, feed, grow, and guide love. We can all plant seeds, though only some of us may be so lucky as to sit in their shade. I'm just one individual. Can my love make a difference? The answer is unequivocally yes. You might not get to see that difference, but yes. If your love touches one person's heart, even if you never know it, then wasn't it all worth it? Yes, your love makes a difference. Yes, loving and living in God's love is often a struggle and often frustrating, but yes, your love makes a difference, an impact that may be so profound that you can't even imagine it. But here's what we do. I'm thinking now of Paul, the apostle. And if you read in, I believe it's 2 Corinthians, you can get a nice little list of all the things that he said had happened to him in his struggle to carry the word of God throughout the Roman Empire. He received the lash, I can't remember how many times, 40 plus 1. He was beaten, but flogged several times. He was beaten, he was imprisoned, he was shipwrecked. All those things happened to him, but he kept on struggling. And in Philippians, now a prisoner and in danger of losing his life, he writes to talk about how he's willing to and has thrown away all the great things he had in life because they were to him as rubbish compared to the surpassing love of knowing and loving Christ Jesus. And he said about the struggle to know Jesus, and he said about the struggle to share God's love, "This one thing I do, I forget about the things behind me, and I reach out for the things ahead of me. The goal I pursue is the price of God's upward call in Christ Jesus." My friends, your love can make a difference. Keep on keeping on, and may God bless you all of this week. Have a very good week. Bye-bye now.